Well, look, Steve, I remember, by the way, if you're listening to this podcast just as a regular podcast listener, that's fine. If you're looking at it in video, I have to apologize. Steve's just come from the gym, and so he's still in his gym attire. Thank God it's just, almost the sign of a muscle there. Let's go. I wonder if I can do that.
I know.
Yeah, okay, you win on that one. Now, look, I remember, well, I've got cyclist legs, though. You know, if we were doing a brawn competition.
Watch out for my squats leg. Sorry.
Oh, well, okay. All right. Anyway, meanwhile, back to the subject in hand.
Back to the real stuff, the serious stuff.
There'll be a lot of people listening to this, just listening to it, not watching the video, going, thank God I haven't switched to the video option. Now, look, I remember on this podcast when we first spoke about William Nordhaus becoming the joint winner of the 2018 Nobel Prize in Economics for his work on economic modeling of climate change. And at the time, I remember I suggested to you that, maybe this is a good thing because at least it put the idea of climate change having an influence on the economy onto the agenda. But how wrong was I on that? Because his DICE model, the dynamic integrated model of climate and the economy, well, the DICE model is decidedly dicey, isn't it? We've since discovered. And it seems that he, like many economists, seems to be saying that, the idea of limiting temperature rises to 1.5 degrees is just too costly. The cost outweighs the damages. Would actually be better doing nothing at all, which is very convenient, isn't it? But I mean, so how can he say that when we all know that the impact of climate change unchecked is going to be catastrophic? We can't just let it go.
Well, he's actually made up his own numbers to make it look like it's not catastrophic. And this is the thing that sort of surprised me, because I remember when that first happened, and I actually had the same thing. At least they're giving an award to somebody who's worked on climate change. Yeah. I'd forgotten that his first real sorting into the area was to attack the limits to growth. And the predecessor report done by Jay Forrester is one of the world's truly great intellects. And Forrester had designed what he called system dynamics. And one of the first applications he made of that outside applying it to manufacturing plants was to consider the world as an overall system where there's population growth, which is possible because there's food growth, which is possible because we are using petroleum-based fertilizers to grow more food, which is possible because of the amount of energy, et cetera, et cetera. And he did all the feedbacks and came out with his own set of predictions slightly before a third model. He built what he called World 1 and didn't publish it. World 2 is what he spoke about and Nordhaus criticised, and then World 3 became the basis of limits to growth. And Nordhaus was completely and absolutely disparaging of this. Now, knowing this technology myself, and having read the same book when he wrote those disparaging remarks back in 1972, 73, I knew he was wrong in most of the claims he made. For he said there was not based on empirical data. Now, in fact, what the authors had done quite painstakingly before they wrote the book was to build a set of indices for population, pollution, land use, available reserves of resources, compressing all those things into a set of 7 or thereabouts numbers, which they then had a time series for going back to 1900. Yeah. And what they did, first of all, was to make sure the model backcast from 1970, I think is when they began the model, from 1970 back to 1900 and roughly fitted the data they had. And then they ran it forward.
Yeah, which is convenient. So that's his idea of empirical analysis.
No. That's what's the limits to growth did, and that was valid.
Right.
Okay. So Nordhaus didn't even know that happened. I mean, the guy's capacity to read something and not see what's on black and white paper is quite remarkable. We'll talk about that later. But he claimed there was not that's garbage. There was empirical data behind the World 2 model, behind World 3. The mistake that the authors of Limits to Growth made was not publishing that actual data in the book itself.
Right.
But they did refer to it. It was available. It was in previous studies.
But it was a general read, wasn't it? I mean, the Club of, because this all came out of the Club of Rome, Limits to Growth was sort of like the accessible, buy it in an airport bookshop general read for everybody because they wanted to get it out to as many people as possible. So understandably.
Yeah, and they cut down some of the technicalities. That's correct. And so when Nordhaus's first paper disparaged the Limits to Growth and Forrester's work, Forrester wrote a reply, which wasn't published in an economic journal, pointing out that all the tricks that Nordhaus did with the model were wrong back in 1972. And that's the background story. From that point on, Nordhaus specialised, so-called, in climate change, economics of climate change.
Yeah.
And so I then, when I had finally made my own contribution in the area by writing the work on the role of energy in production, I thought it was time for me to actually read that literature. And I'm sorry I left it so long, because having disparaged Forrester for not using empirical data, which was a fallacy, Nordhaus made up his own bloody numbers. That's the only way he can describe it. Made up numbers that fitted his preconception that climate change had no impact.
Well, or very minor impact, but his numbers. I mean, just to the layperson, his numbers are becoming more evidently nonsense, aren't they? So he reckoned, based on 2005 prices, the cost of climate change, if we did nothing, it was going to be $22.6 trillion. But if we try and restrict the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, then it's going to cost $37 trillion. So we save money by doing nothing. As I say, very, very convenient. Basically, he's saying environmental damage at 1.5 degrees is about 10 trillion. The cost of abatement is going to be 27 trillion. But trillions are big numbers, or they were, weren't they, until this year. Now we've had COVID-19. And as a planet, we're spending more than that this year, just trying to go against something that we just didn't see coming. So those numbers actually seem quite small now. So people are going to look and go, hang on a second, if COVID-19's cost this much, you're saying climate change is going to cost less? I mean, there's going to be a question mark over that.
And then that's what's going to start happening, because the claims themselves, the one that I most like, the claims from his 2018 American Economic Journal paper, where he said that a 3-degree increase in temperature will reduce GDP by 2% compared to what it would have been in the complete absence of climate change. Now, putting those in terms of the trillions, American economy is about $20 trillion. Let's say the whole globe is $100 trillion. He's saying, in effect, the costs of a 3-degree increase are about $2 trillion. No, it's not the trees, it's the percentage of GDP that really lets you get a handle on this. So a 3-degree increase in temperature will only cause a 2% fall in GDP. Yeah. Which is so trivial, it's not even rounding error.
Well, so the OECD is saying probably 10% at best.
Well, the scientists are saying probably human extinction.
Yeah, no, I'm saying, but this year the OECD estimates are probably we're seeing the GDP fall by at least 10% as a result of COVID-19.
Yeah, but these are all nonsense.
So COVID-19 is 5 times worse than climate change is going to be. That's telling us.
Yeah, exactly. Which is, he said, hang on a second, what's going on here? Well, I decided to take a look at what's going on, and I have, you start to spend half a century. I've been critiquing neoclassical economics and Marxian economics as well. And in that entire time, I've never read anything as bad as I've read the work by Nordhaus, Toll, Mendelssohn. It is just, they have simply suffered from what I call the neoclassical disease of let's make up an assumption that makes the problem disappear.
But isn't also, when he talks about using empirical evidence, and I take your point that Club of Rome used a lot of data going back a long way. But he'd say, well, his approach is doing that as well, looking at the timeline. But there's a danger with doing that as well, isn't there? Because because things unexpected happen. You have, with climate, you've got tipping points. We can't look at it as a linear progression. So, and yet I'm sure that's his idea of empirical analysis, isn't it? No, no one forecast the impact this year of COVID-19. We'll get to understand why we're getting more of these diseases, and perhaps you can start to model them. But at the moment, it's just a completely an unknown as far as we're concerned.
Oh, that's right. It's unknowns. If you take the old Rumfeld line, But what he's done is tie it down to known irrelevancies, and this is what surprised me, because we do know, for example, that Florida is hotter than New York. And New York is hotter than North Dakota, and that New York earns more per capita than Florida or North Dakota. So if I drew a relationship between the two, I go like an upside-down parabola. Oh, that'll do. Well, let's just assume exactly the same thing applies with climate change.
Right. So he's done that, has he? He's basically looked at the temperatures. He has
simply looked at current relationship between temperature and GDP and said that that's what we're going to find from climate change.
Well, that's crazy, isn't it? So that would be like saying, well, okay, we can look at Sydney, where you've got a temperature which averages 27 degrees in January and 18 degrees in July as the top, and we can look at London, which is less than 24 degrees as its average maximum. So London could be 3 degrees or 4 degrees warmer, and still have the GDP per capita that you're getting in Sydney, which is probably pretty similar. Places like Manchester, which are cooler than, obviously quite a bit cooler than Sydney, and have a much lower GDP. If they got warmer up to the Sydney temperature, then Manchester's GDP would increase.
And that's exactly the sort of reasoning they made. And
that's nuts.
I mean, it's just. I mean, when I first saw that, I mean, my partner has no interest in the work that I do, and is Buddhist, and that's very useful because she walked into the office and I'd read this line written by Richard Toll in an extremely bad paper that has been revised 3 times. I think it's at least twice, possibly 3 times, for errors, such as having a plus sign where there should be a minus sign in numerical estimates. But in that, he said that he claimed Mendelssohn, a guy called Mendelssohn, was the first person to do this. In fact, it was Nordhaus who first did this. They simply took temperature and GDP data across the USA and fitted this curve to it, which is a scatter plot that is ridiculous. I'll show you the scatter plot in a moment. Did that and simply said, oh, well, we can fit this with a parabola, roughly speaking, and yeah, warmer places do less well than cold places do less well than medium places, and medium places do better than hot places.
Right.
And then that's what's going to happen. We assume that what happens over space will happen over time. Now, that sounds like a clever line. And a lot of this stuff is trying to be clever with language. And but what is
basically it's basing it just on GDP versus temperature. Today, without any of the historical factors about how those towns
without any change in the energy retained. Yeah,
but also why those towns developed where they did, what natural resources are around, the settlement patterns, all the history which determines the wealth of a city. I mean, it's slightly more complicated model than just America. I mean, if you applied it and applied anywhere else, like in the developing world where you've got very low GDP and high temperatures, that model would be blown out of the water.
Well, the model it's not the fact you compare it with somewhere else on the planet. It's that it's completely irrelevant to what climate change is about. And if I can do a screen share here, I'll just show you. You've got to enable it for me.
Yeah. So if you're listening to this as a podcast, then this is why you should be watching on video. Except I understand.
Indeed. So,
given how we've described Steve.
So just do a share, and I'll show this particular plot. This is the data. This is an example of the data. It's not quite the same data he used, but it's pretty close. And that is what I've got here is the horizontal line here is the deviation of temperatures in the United States by state from the average, which is 11.5 degrees Celsius. That's 11.5 there. That's 9.5. That's 13.5 degrees.
Yeah.
Up here we have GDP deviations from the average.
No.
I think that's about, I've forgotten what the exact average is, but I've got it in the data.
So I can't see any pattern there whatsoever.
I know, but if you fit a parabola to it, you get this. You can get a vague fit to it here. Okay.
Right.
Now,
isn't that vague the key word?
Vague is a very good word. Now, that not only is that the curve that they applied to say this is what climate change is going to do. So, for example, if we have a 10-degree, this model, inverted commas, God, clown faces either side, and predicts that if you have a 10-degree increase in temperature, you will suffer a 30% fall in GDP. Now,
based on observations of existing temperatures
in existing GDP. Now, if we raise the temperature
in just American towns,
so they've generalised it to the rest of the world in various ways since then. But this premise means that they're saying if you increase the global temperature by 10 degrees, you would reduce GDP by a mere 30%. Now, 10 degrees is about the increase in energy level that occurred during some of the worst extinctions in the history of life on this planet. And what to actually increase the temperature of the atmosphere alone by that much, by 10 degrees Celsius. Just to bring up that number on my paper here. The amount of energy is equivalent to letting off a Hiroshima bomb every 1.6 square kilometres on the planet, and that's not even including warming up the ocean, which is what this is also doing, because the ocean weighs 250 times as much as the, pardon me, stuffing up the screen here, the ocean weighs 250 times as much as the atmosphere. So to increase both, and what they're doing is equilibrium modelling. So they're saying 10 degrees is an equilibrium situation. Sometime in the far future, once all this energy has been absorbed or retained from the sun because of the extra carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, to do that with our own means, to add the energy ourselves rather than retain what's coming in from the sun, we'd need to let off a Hiroshima bomb every couple of square metres on the planet.
So the problem is, because he's retrofitting models, I suspect, but to try and argue his case, and he's a Nobel Prize winner. Politicians are going to listen to him more than they're going to listen to you, for example, and more to the point, they're going to use him as an excuse for not doing enough. And
exactly,
you do worry about that, because you look at so, for example, the UK's government policy towards climate change, and I think the UK is doing more than some countries, like Australia, for example, which continues to dig up coal and has a prime minister who's taking coal into Parliament and talked about how good it is. The UK government has 5 priorities for climate change. One is research. Well, that could just be reading Nordhaus, couldn't it? So that's not a good one.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Another one is planting trees. That's fine, but how many? I'm not quite sure how many wouldn't be room to move, I suspect, by the time they've planted enough. Another is retrofitting houses to make them more energy efficient. So that's fine. But again, a drop in the ocean, I suspect. But a big one is spending $5.2 billion on flood defences. So in other words, it's like we're accepting it's happening. So how are we going to mitigate against it? Not how we're going to prevent it, but how are we going to protect ourselves from it? It all sounds a bit piecemeal, doesn't it? Of course, in the US, they're doing even less, given that, you've got a president there who wants to be the dominant supplier of global energy through fracking. And vowed to turn everything that Barack Obama had done on greenhouse gas emissions to turn it around very, very quickly, he said. So there's not a lot of hope, is there, that things are going to change? And Nordhaus obviously is going to be the politician's friend on all of this.
And that's the trouble, because people have accepted these numbers as if they're realistic. And of course, they're also published by the IPCC, the UN government, the intergovernmental body that tries to revise about the dangers of climate change. It's dominated by these same neoclassical economists, not Nordhaus personally, but people like Richard Toll, who has since resigned because he thought it was too alarmist. They, in 2014, claimed that the impact of global warming, like again about a 3-degree temperature increase, which they thought would take till 2100, that will reduce GDP in 2100 by 2%, between 0.2 and 2%, compared to what it would have been in the complete absence of climate change, which again is such a trivial amount of a decline in the rate of growth of the economy over the next 80 years that you wouldn't even bother doing anything about it. And the foundation for that are the most absurd assumptions where they're making up these numbers. So they assume, as that's the point about the temperature thing, that increasing global temperature by 10 degrees is a bit like moving North Dakota to New York. No big deal.
But I mean,
instead, it'll wipe out most life on the planet.
Yeah, well, I mean, but that is the point, isn't it? I mean, that is what is wrong with that model. If you, I gave the example of Manchester before. If you increase the temperature in Manchester by 2 degrees, but you didn't increase everywhere else by 2 degrees, we might be able to cope with that. It's when you're adding that 2 degrees everywhere else, including the places that are already hot. That's when you've got the problem, isn't it?
That's right. And there'll be parts of the planet which we're already seeing now, which have temperatures that have never been recorded before in the history of our existence on the planet as a species. And if you talk about a 10-degree temperature, then that's something which the planet has had, after it's ceased being a ball of molten Earth. It's had a 2 or 3 brief periods in several billion years where the temperature's been that high. So the thought we can drive up to that stage and capitalism will just basically sneeze and say this is nothing, that's the mental attitude they've got. And they've made up those numbers in 3 ways. One is by this crazy idea you can use the current GDP temperature correlations to predict what's going to happen with climate change. The other is they simply assume that anything that occurs indoors won't be affected by climate change.
I read that as well. That is crazy, isn't it? So we're all going to be fine. Industry's not going to be impacted if that industry is indoors. That's
right. It didn't quite say indoors. It said carefully controlled environments.
Right.
And the examples he gave were this is Nordhaus's first paper in 1991, were chip fabrication and surgery. But he then assumed that all of manufacturing, all of mining, which is hilarious because a lot of it's open cut these days, of course, all of mining, all of services, all of retail, all of wholesale would be unaffected. And therefore, he presumed that 87% of America's GDP would not be affected by climate change. Now, if you assume that, for Christ's fucking sake, you check your assumption. Go and ask a scientist. Is this reasonable? The third thing they did was ignore scientists.
Yeah. Well, let's get onto that in a second, because I've got a question on that. Economists versus scientists. That's a bit of a problem, isn't it? Because they speak different languages. Their brains are geared differently. And so how are they going to get on and reach a conclusion? But just on the, it's all fine for us all indoors. So we can all go retail shopping. We can go to our Westfield shopping centre. That's indoors. But food's grown outside. Wouldn't that be a slightly fundamental problem?
It doesn't seem to occur to people like Richard Toll, who when a meteorologist said, are you assuming that just adding 10 degrees to temperature everywhere tells you what climate change is going to do? He said that's an insanely stupid assumption fundamentally. And somebody said, another one wrote back and said, are you actually saying that we could cope with a 10-degree increase in global temperature? And Toll replied, we'd move indoors like the Saudis. Now, where do the Saudis get their food from? Okay, they import it from overseas because it's too damn hot and too damn dry to grow anything in that country. If the entire planet becomes as hot as Saudi Arabia, where do we import it from? Mars? So
how is there any credibility whatsoever given to these people?
Because nobody's looked at them. Nobody's looked at them in this detail. And this is what horrifies me. It's not just the neoclassicals and the policymakers that I'm critical of. It's actually my own fellow heterodox economists. And I've got guilty of this myself. I haven't looked at their stuff for this length of time. I've been focusing on, Minsky's financial instability hypothesis and stuff like that. And when I said I was going to look at Nordhaus in detail, a few of my colleagues wrote to me and said, it's just the discount rate. He applies a really high discount rate so that if you discount the future by 7% per annum and you're going a century in the future, then damages in a century come out as trivial today. And that was my expectation. That's what I thought I'd find. No, they made up numbers that made it look like nothing significant was going to happen in the next century, and that climate change will have a trivial impact on the economy. And there was by those 3 methods, by this using current, what I call cross-sectional data, to say they can predict the impact of climate change, ignoring the huge amount of energy that is involved in raising the temperature of the globe, by pretending anything that happens indoors won't be affected, and then by asking scientists what they thought and diluting what the scientists said with comments of such ecological geniuses as Larry Summers.
So I'm not a scientist, as you know. In fact, I'm not, really that smart. Generally, I just have this ability to talk, which somehow manages to allow me to scrape a living. So for someone of my limited intellect, that model of let's look at existing temperatures, let's take a snapshot and apply GDP and assume that if we move any of those cities up to the warmer or colder cities, then the GDP is going to change accordingly. I mean, you don't need to be that smart to realize that it's just full of shit, do you?
Exactly. It is full of shit. And the reason why they don't react that way is because they have shit methodology. And that's why I trace it really back to Milton Friedman, because Friedman was the one who said you can't test a theory on the basis of its assumptions. And And that argument is what neoclassicals throw at you whenever you try to say these assumptions are crazy. They'll say, oh, you can't test a theory by its assumptions. You simply have to see whether the predictions work out. Well, in this particular case, you don't want to find by testing it, oh dear, the assumption's wrong. Terribly sorry, you're all extinct. Oh, damn. We couldn't work it out before we did the experiment of changing the climate of the entire planet.
At least we know next time we have a planet. Exactly.
Next time species evolve, they'll know that this particular assumption doesn't work. So the next species that comes along after humans, if they can manage to translate our cuneiforms, will tell us what to do. But this is Friedman, and that's where it all comes from.
Right. I mean, and isn't this the part of the problem is that the economists and scientists are talking a completely different language. So scientists might say, 1.5 degrees, you start to get much above that, and then you really start to see an impact on the human race and ecosystems. And economists are there trying to put numbers to that and saying, it's not all that bad. And they can't compromise, can they? And an economist can't say, well, look, rather than we'll make it slightly worse if you'll just reduce the temperature, increase the temperature at which things start to get bad. You can't reach a compromise. It's all or nothing.
It's all or nothing, and we should throw the economists out. I want to share screen again and show you where this nonsense comes from. It's Milton Friedman, and this is an argument he made to try to get around people criticising neoclassical economics on the basis of its assumptions. And this is the argument that mainstream economists swallow when they're at university. They're saying assumptions, you can't judge a theory by the realism of its assumptions. You said important hypotheses will have assumptions that are wildly inaccurate, and therefore the more significant the theory, the more unrealistic the assumptions. Now that's the line they swallow. And what he's basically saying, which is what they think is realistic, is that assumptions that you make a simplifying assumption. So, for example, Galileo assumed, I think it was Galileo, he assumes that there's no air resistance when he drops 2 lead balls out of the Leaning Tower of Pisa, which were different masses. And he said that's wildly unrealistic to say there's no air in Pisa. However, it's not wildly unrealistic to say that air resistance is trivial for 2 masses of that density that close to the planet. So what is a simplifying assumption leaves out details that if you include them have only a tiny effect on your results.
But isn't an assumption saying that if you move the temperature of one city to the temperature of another city, that city will automatically adopt the GDP of the second city?
Yeah, well, what they're doing, they're not making simplifying assumptions. They're making what somebody else called domain assumptions, a guy called Musgrave. And simplifying assumptions, the idea that the assumptions are wildly unrealistic. No, if you make a genuine simplifying assumption and you then remove the simplifying assumption, you get a much more complicated result, which is only a small way different to what you actually said in the first place. So we take the idea of Galileo dropping 2 lead balls out of the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and he assumed effectively air resistance could be ignored. Well, if you try to take air resistance into account, I'm not sure, but I think the small dense ball would hit the ground faster than the large dense ball. No. So what he said, he said, well, if I drop them out of the tower, they'll both fall at the same rate, whereas the theory that he was contradicting, which is Aristotle, was the heavier thing would fall faster.
Right. So it's
irrelevant, and if he took it into account, would actually make his results slightly stronger, because I think the way the air resistance is relative to the square of the area of the area of the ball, whereas the mass is the volume. I've got a feeling you'd actually find the small ball fell slightly faster. So in other words, you can make that assumption, and you don't. If you take it out, your results don't change. But if you make this assumption, and it's wrong, your assumptions, the results are completely different.
Wrong. And isn't that part of the problem then? That, how do we know what the irrelevances are? Because it is such a complex science, whereas economists are obviously trying to simplify everything, and they might take the wrong stuff out. And also, there's the whole question about tipping points. So if you start to say, well, we're looking for empirical evidence, you're basing it on what's happening in the past rather than what's happening in the future. And economists don't know what they don't know in terms of all of that. What we do know, for example, is things like the fact that the Arctic Circle reached 38 degrees. degrees the last couple of months, the highest ever. And we know that, the retreat of ice in the Arctic Circle means there's less solar reflection. I'm fairly certain that's not in Nordhaus's model. In fact, you wonder, if you're just looking at economic numbers and you're not looking at the scientific models, you're comparing apples and oranges, and isn't that the problem?
Not just that; it's also for outright dishonesty, and this is the thing which amazed me, because when
why would he do that? Well, I mean, why would he have an interest in doing that? Apart from the fact it's won him a prize for the shelf.
He just wants to reach a conclusion that the market economy can handle climate change. All you've got to do is do what they call cover an externality. So there's no price on carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. You put a price on it. Therefore, people who are producing carbon dioxide will produce less, or they'll find technology that doesn't produce it in the first place, and the market system will solve all the problems. Yeah, that argument is something which trivializes the issue, but it doesn't work if you find that there are some, like for some points, for example, you lose the Arctic sea ice, and then the entire climate of the planet changes. And we have no idea of what that future is. The uncertainties you were talking about earlier come to the fore. So he literally not only ignored what scientists had, he contradicted what they said. And this is the thing which, I found a lot of garbage in looking through Nordhaus work. This is probably the worst. That's the way he treated work by University of Sussex, might be University of Surrey, a climate scientist called Tim Lenton. Mm-hmm. Have you seen Lenton and his colleagues? Lenton did an expert survey of climatologists and geologists and so on, where he said, can we work out whether there are elements in the climate that will tip, so go from one qualitative state to another? And can we work out the temperatures at which they will occur? And the very first time they did this back in 2008, they concluded they were looking at, they limited it to very large features of the Earth, so features that were more than 1,000 kilometres in length, or and ones which would be tipped by what we did this century. And they identified about 8. But one of the obvious ones was Arctic sea ice, Greenland, and West Antarctic, thermohaline solution, the Gulf Stream, and so on. And in that, they finally concluded that the most critical danger was Arctic sea ice disappearing in the next 10 to 20 years. And I'll just show you that quote again, because I just want to start with what was actually said by the scientists rather than what Nordhaus claimed they said. So I'll just highlight this, and here is what Lenton and co said. I'll just share the screen now.
Yeah, the expectation is mounting. Okay. Here we go.
We conclude that the greatest and clearest threat is that the Arctic summer sea ice, with loss likely to occur long before and potentially contribute to Greenland ice shelf melt. Okay, and when you look at their table, the table they put together to talk about this, let's see, I had this, let's see here. Okay, this is their table from the Lenton survey, pardon me, taking a while to scroll down to it. Okay, policy relevant future temping points. So Arctic summer sea ice, global warming of between 0.5 and 2 degrees Celsius will happen on time scale of decades and will give us amplified warming and so on. And then they say, and that's the greatest and clearest threat. Okay, that's there. Yeah. What does Nordhaus do? He shows this table. This is table N1 in his book, The Climate Casino. And he has tipping element, yes, 10 years, correct. Threshold warming, +5 to -2, correct. Level of most concern, only 1 star. Where does that come from?
Right.
He made it up.
Even though it's happening.
He made it up because the only time where the critical turns up here in Lenton's table, this is when critical values. Now, when you check and see what do they mean by critical values, it says unidentified. Oh, great. He said, oh, unidentified, not a problem. Okay. What they meant was they didn't know what temperature between 0.5 and 2 would actually cause the Arctic sea ice to disappear, but they were sure there was a temperature level that would cause it within that range. Okay, they simply hadn't tied it down accurately. That's the only way that I can say he could have looked at this and dreamt up this idea, as he said. And this is This is now from Nordhaus. He says, a few systematic surveys, one by Lenton, their review finds no critical tipping elements with a time horizon of less than 300 years until global temperatures have increased by at least 3 degrees Celsius. In plain English, that can be called a lie.
Yeah.
Because this thing here, that's the fallacy.
Yeah.
And when you look at what they themselves said, they did say it was critical. And this, again, is the conclusion of the article.
But, I mean, if you talk to the man in the street, they would say the disappearance of Arctic sea ice is almost certainly a concern, wouldn't they? So I wonder whether Nordhaus is going to be found out to be a fraud over time.
I hope so. This is fraudulent work.
Because a lot of this just seems so clearly wrong, doesn't it? And yet, he's obviously. I'm going to answer a question I asked you. Why would he be doing this? And look, in my mind, Steve, you could make a lot more money, I suspect, if you were able to consult to governments and tell them what they wanted to hear. Your problem is you give them bad news. They want to pay to hear that. They want somebody with a good reputation to tell them exactly what they want to hear. So that's which is interesting, isn't it? Because you do get a lot of the right-wing media saying that there's a lot of people in this climate change game to make money. So people point to the IPCC, for example, and climate change scientists and saying, no, this is all, climate change is a fraud. People are saying it's bad just because they can make money.
To make a fortune out of grant money. I know it's a total joke.
But I mean, it actually does go the other way, doesn't it? Because I'm sure Nordhaus is making money consulting, telling governments what they want to hear.
But it's not the money that motivates him. And this is one reason I'm in Debunking Economics. I quoted one of my old school teachers who we were having a class debate, which he let us do without intervention most of the time, about a politician. And we were everybody was criticizing, and somebody said, at least he's sincere. And the whole class agreed and says, yeah, okay, we're giving it sincere. And the teacher piped up and said, don't overrate sincerity. The most sincere person you'll meet in your life is the maniac chasing you down the road with an axe trying to chop your head off. Now, that is the situation. Nordhaus sincerely believes that climate change will have trivial impact on the capitalist economy. But because he does believe it, he's likely to get amplified, he's got his views amplified by people who want that to be the story. So all the climate change denial groups, and particularly the Born Lomborg types of the world, jump on it, and he gets benefit out of that. So they amplify him. He doesn't get a great deal of money out of it. He certainly gets more money than I do. But he gets amplified because he's saying what the powers that be wish to hear.
So, and his work is fundamentally, it's a cost-benefit analysis, isn't it? I guess that's right. There's always problems with you look at any cost. It's hard to find a cost-benefit analysis, even for small engineering projects, for example, that ultimately are shown to have been correct. And and his conclusion out of all of this is, we can go hotter, but and it's going to cost us less than the mitigating action. We won't feel the impact too much. We just need to wear t-shirts and don't go in, and stay indoors, basically.
Look, I'm doing what.
You're already following this example. There we are.
It's lovely going outside and it's 34 degrees every day, and 37 in summer. It's insanely unconnected to the physical reality of the planet. And what amazes me is how bad the work is. I mean, I remember when I first started going, I thought I'd have to explain, first of all, partly why high discount rates weren't justified. I mentioned that to be a major thing. Yeah. And then to explain why you shouldn't use an equilibrium model, which is what DICE is. It's built on the Ramsey growth model, which presumes equilibrium through time. I thought I was going to be arguing why that was inappropriate and why you had to cover the transition process rather than moving between one equilibrium and another. I haven't even got to that stage yet, because the assumptions they made up to produce their so-called data were so outrageously and transparently bad. I
wonder whether, and we'll wrap this up in a second, but I do wonder whether, in fact, we're not going to move far from Nordhaus in thinking, though, because if you just look at what we've been through this year, where we took a lot of mitigating action to try and prevent the spread of a virus that was ravaging the world. And now we've got a lot of people saying, "Oh, we went too far, and the cure is worse than the problem was," forgetting the fact that we we stopped the problem getting worse. And people now saying, that we should have just, the cost of the economy has been too great, ignoring the fact that if we hadn't taken that cost, then a lot more people would be dead, and therefore the economy would be worse off as a result of that. We seem to forget very quickly, and I can see people quickly jumping to that same conclusion with climate change, that the cure is going to be worse than the problem, which is obviously exactly what Nordhaus is saying.
Yeah, and the trouble is, what I'm saying is that the people who are saying that claim at the moment are basing themselves on research which is so bad.
Yeah.
That if they're aware of how bad the research is, then they're being duplicitous and mendacious. If they're not aware, they're being conned just as much as the rest of us are by their arguments that it's trivial.
Yeah.
And I really wonder, I wonder to what extent people who funded this stuff and who give Nordhaus accolades have actually read what he's written. Because when you read it, you just think this is just crazy.
But Steve, he's got a Nobel Prize.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, I mean, that's one reason to shut the Nobel Prize down.
All right. I mean, there is one other camp of people who, aside from whatever Nordhaus is saying, and I suspect you might fit into this, rather than the people saying, oh, well, we don't need to do much because the damage isn't going to be too great. There's the other camp that says, well, the damage is going to be great, but it's too late anyway.
Yeah, and that's the other. I mean, the question is whether what I think has happened, and looking at things like the Human Ecological Footprint study and a whole range of other studies, we've massively overshot what was sustainable. So we've got to go backwards. And with people are talking about degrowth, we need a period where we drastically reduce the load we put on the biosphere. Now, I think we've been pushed so far past that sustainable point that we're likely to see ecological breakdowns coming through and completely overwhelming anything humans try to do in that process. So I see it as being extremely chaotic, but we simply have to try.
Yeah, it sounds hard, Steve. It's better just to stay indoors, isn't it? Really?
Yeah, there you go.
and wear singlets. All right, very good. We'll catch you again very soon. Thank you for taking us through that.
Okay.